Now, probably the biggest winner out of all of this, my personal favourite point on it, the whole thing, is how student debt and HEX is going to be treated. So previously, or as of right now, if you've got a HEX debt, every year it's indexed to inflation. Now, in high inflationary environments, you could be paying up to 7 or 8% if you're at that high point. Now, HEX debt and student debt will actually be indexed to either wage growth, that index, or CPI. Which one of the two is lower? What are your thoughts?
I actually think out of everything we've discussed so far, that's an okay policy insofar as long as the debt's being repaid. You know, we're seeing in America at the moment, the Democrats are trying to write off student debt. As long as the debt's being repaid, because it's not down to the taxpayer to fund your jaunt to university and future career prospects. It's down to you to take it seriously and dollarise that thereafter. So I think the fact that it's not a debt forgiveness is a good thing. And look, it's a practical solution. It's probably quite attractive too from a garnering vote perspective. That said, when CPI was very low, having student debt indexed to inflation was never a problem.
No issues.
So what we're saying is that let's just forget about inflation, we'll park that to the side and we'll benchmark it off something else. I don't think I think the principle behind it's okay, and out of everything we've discussed, it's not the worst thing. But again, it's just a flag of convenience to really peg to the issue is getting inflation down, and then repaying your HEX debt is not a problem. Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show. This week we are exploring the 2024 federal budget. Winners and losers in the short term, as is the case with all budgets. Plenty to take out of this. The question you've got to ask yourself is, what is the long-term outlook from this? Because as any investor, you've got to be looking forward, not just looking in the here and now. Plenty of notes to take, but most importantly, make sure you take plenty of action. Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show with me, your host, Andrew Baxter, and as always, my offsider and co-host, Mitchell Olarenshaw.
Gee whiz, have we got a fun episode installed today, AB? What else would we be talking about other than the budget? This is the Economist's grand final for the year, so no doubt you're over the moon, jumping with excitement.
I am. The federal budget, it comes around every year, rather like an unloved season, doesn't it? And plenty to rake out of this one. A little bit divisive, a little bit partisan, and definitely a Labor budget for the electorate that vote for them.
Absolutely. And if you're anyone, you probably don't want to read the budget, because I can assure you after reading it, it is very, very boring. So I guess the goal of today's podcast is to not only break down the winners and losers of the budget, but to actually talk about the kind of effect it'll actually have on the economy.
Indeed. Look, where do you want to start? I'll let you run off the structure.
Let's go with the winners. Let's start with the good news first.
Look, there were some tax changes, and I think tax changes is a very liberal term, if we can roll that across 2 or 3 areas. So there are winners and losers within the tax changes. I suppose for everybody that is a taxpayer in Australia, there are some changes and some small benefits for them. Tax changes, as I understand it, will have obviously far more of an impact at the lower income level, which you could argue is, that's good. That's money going into grassroots society, the area of the economy that might be struggling a little bit, and it's really come at the expense of high income earners, as is usually the case.
Yeah, and we could probably touch on that as a loser as well. Yes, everyone is getting a tax cut, but if you're a high income earner, you're actually getting less than half of what you thought you were going to get. So rather than being $9,000, it's something in the order of about $4,500.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, there'll be those people go, well, you can afford it, but that's not the issue here. It is a broken electoral promise, one of many that we've seen so far in this particular government, but I'm sure it's something we'll come back to and discuss. But yeah, I mean, tax changes, lower tax for people is always a good thing if you're trying to stimulate your economy. And I think the overarching conversation will arrive at, if I had to summarise Dr. Chalmers, do we have to call him Chalmers? Dr. Chalmers? I don't think
Treasurer?
So. The Treasurer, Jim.
We don't need to address by name, do we?
Definitely not doctor. My view on doctors is really simple. When they do the call on the airplane, if they say, is there a doctor on board, if you're the person that gets up and fixes the problem, you can call yourself a doctor. If you've got a social studies degree, you're not a doctor. Don't use it as a moniker. Okay. Now we've got that one out of the way. Look, I think what you give away on one hand invariably comes back on the other. So if you've a lower or tax cut, certainly for lower income earners, they're likely to spend that money, which is stimulatory for the economy, which is typically what you want. You want a stimulated economy, albeit we're in a situation at the moment, of course, where we have inflation and we're trying to slow things down. So if I were to overarch everything, it's a budget that's for inflation.
So a question on tax cuts then specifically. The threshold for when that marginal rate at a higher level kicks in is gone up, which is good, and the marginal rates have gone down towards the lower side. Now, if you're paying less tax, or even your tax returns might be greater year on year, that money's then likely going to be spent somewhere, right? So shouldn't that increase inflation? not
It is.
decrease it.
It is an inflationary budget. It's going to cause inflation. That's the benefit for every person here in Australia is higher inflation, and probably higher interest rates for longer. So if you're a mortgage holder or someone that's struggling with the cost of living, someone's just chosen to pour kerosene on your problem and make it bigger.
Well, speaking of cost of living, the next winner, if we can call it that, and we'll give these a soft category because we don't know whether they're actually winners or losers.
So
in
I'm in a
actual
competitive
sense.
mood with you. That's
Yeah,
why.
I know. So I'll try and avoid categorising. So there's a energy bill relief subsidy.
Yep.
So $300 per annum off your energy bill, which will reduce the average cost by about 17%. If you're a small business turning over less than $1 million a year, it's $325 per annum, and that's split over 4 payments throughout the year.
Look, again, I'll be very careful as to not sound too cynical and try and be objective with this. Labor promised a $275 energy rebate when they came into office 3 years ago, which they've failed to deliver up until this point in time. So this, I think, is more of a box tick to say, look, we met our election promise of giving you in fact, it's more, it's $300. Look, that's the negative, the cynicism side coming out of me, I suppose. On the other side of the coin, I think a lot of households are certainly struggling with higher energy costs, and anything coming into your household when you're struggling is a good thing, and we like to see people not struggle. The challenge with it is that when that money flows in, it then becomes, like any subsidy, more money in circulation and therefore inflationary, which over the long term will end up pushing either energy prices or the price of something else up higher.
See, I'm starting to get this weird feeling that maybe it's not a cost of living relief budget, but rather an inflationary budget, as you're saying.
It's designed to ensure that people vote for you because, look, we delivered this, we helped you out, and so on and so forth. Anything that involves large-scale subsidy on money that, to all intents and purposes, is not earned is inflationary, because if you've earned your money and you know how hard you've had to work for it, you tend to be less frivolous in the way that you spend it. Now, again, I'll couch that comment. There are people that are low-income earners that literally have to spend every dollar that comes in the door to try and survive at the moment. And this is not a budget that will help them in the long or medium term. They might get some short-term relief, but overall they'll be paying for it through higher prices elsewhere.
Gee whiz, it's a little scary, isn't it? Speaking, though, of short-term relief, so rental assistance. Now, we know we're in a rental crisis at the moment. There's been a 10% increase in rental assistance. Now, that works out to be $19 a fortnight in addition to what's currently being earned.
Yeah.
It's not going to make a big difference, really, is it?
Look, no, in a nutshell. In fact, it'll be counterintuitive. Again, on the surface of it, here's some rental relief, so we're helping people that are struggling. The housing crisis, to fix it, we've spoken on this several times in previous podcasts, to fix the housing problem we have in Australia is really simple. We need more houses.
Keep building.
So keep building, yet at the same time, every time you open the newspaper or click online, there's another builder that's gone under. There's a very, very tight construction market. Building approvals aren't increasing. There's more and more red tape to make it cost prohibitive to do that. And you've got a higher interest rate environment, which makes it harder for people to buy a property. So none of those things are creating new supply, which long term will fix the problem. And we'll get on to immigration and the issue that then adds to the situation in a moment. So you have a situation where at the moment here is some free money to subsidise your rent, and all you're going to see happen in there, given that the rental market is a free market, is higher rent. So you may as well just take that $19 a fortnight that was going to the tenant and move it across to the landlord's ledger. The tenant will be paying more in income, or beg your pardon, more in rent, straight in the coffers of the landlord. Doesn't fix the problem of a lack of supply of new houses. So it's a really good short-term publicity fix of a nice headline that we're doing our bit to help the rental crisis. Not really, no. The only way to fix the rental crisis is to increase the supply of properties for rent. And the way to do that is to build more and make it easier to build more. When you put in a subsidy, it's the taxpayer dollar going directly to the landlord.
Got you. Makes a lot of sense, and I get it totally. Now, probably the biggest winner out of all of this, my personal favourite point on it, the whole thing, is how student debt and HECS is going to be treated. So previously, or as of right now, if you've got a HECS debt, every year it's indexed to inflation. Now, in high inflationary environments, you could be paying up to 7 or 8% if you're at that high point. Now, HECS debt and student debt will actually be indexed to either wage growth, that index, or CPI. Which one of the two is lower? What are your thoughts?
I actually think out of everything we've discussed so far, that's an okay policy insofar as long as the debt's being repaid. You know, we're seeing in America at the moment, the Democrats are trying to write off student debt. As long as the debt's being repaid, because it's not down to the taxpayer to fund your jaunt to university and future career prospects, it's down to you to take it seriously and dollarise that thereafter. So I think the fact that it's not a debt forgiveness is a good thing. And look, it's a practical solution. It's probably quite attractive too from a garnering vote perspective. That said, when CPI was very low, having student debt indexed to inflation was never a problem.
No issues.
So what we're saying is that let's just forget about inflation. We'll park that to the side and we'll benchmark it off something else. I don't think you really. I think the principle behind it's okay, and out of everything we've discussed, it's not the worst thing. But again, it's just a flag of convenience to really peg to. The issue is getting inflation down, and then repaying your HEX debt is not a problem. But when you've got CPI that's sticky and won't go down, it's unpopular having things pegged to CPI. So if you take it up the line a little bit and go, well, okay, what's causing the CPI? It's more money chasing fewer goods. So if you've got more money chasing fewer goods, cut the amount of money down that's chasing those goods and prices soften. I say that purely as an economist because that's how inflation effectively is managed. And so adjusting the benchmark, maybe it should be CPI. As long as it's getting repaid, Mitch, that's the main thing, because it's taxpayer money that does need to be repaid. But it's a bit of a flag of convenience changing it. But yeah, I don't have a.
If you've got student debt, you'd be happy.
Yep.
Indeed. Now let's talk about defence. I believe there's about $5.7 billion being spent on defence over the next 4 years, and then the longer term plan, i.e. over the next decade, is even more than that. Why? What kind of effect is that going to have? Look,
it's money potentially that's going into the Australian economy. There you go, more money supply, an inflationary budget.
Yeah, there you go.
That said, given the geopolitics in the world at the moment, having a more robust ability to defend oneself, I think, is something that is important. Looking beyond the budget in terms of anecdotally where that money may go, and there's a great article in the Australian at the weekend talking specifically about the refit on the Collins-class submarines to try and give them another 10 years of life. And I say this, one of my best friends is a submariner. He's in the Royal Navy. He's been over here assisting with the AUKUS submarine project. He's quite senior and quite involved with that. And the view is Australia's never going to be ready for delivery. We don't have the workforce for it. We don't have a base to do it. We don't have the skill set to support it. We don't have the processes in play. And I had the not dissimilar conversation with him a decade ago about the Collins-class submarines. He said it's out-of-date technology before you buy it. So you're trying to extend something that's already clapped out and out of date to get more time out of it when it doesn't even do the job it's supposed to in the first place is torching money. But worse still, the contracting company that's being brought in from overseas to oversee that project of maintenance, and I appreciate that defence budget spend isn't just about submarines, I get that, is an overseas company. So where's the dough going to end up? So taxpayer money going into something that's going to go straight back overseas again. And it seems to be, our way at the moment. There are a lot of policies that are just sort of bobbing around in the water, and they're really lip service versus a really in-depth strategic view.
Indeed. It's a tough one to get right, isn't it? Tough balance by the sounds of things.
I think the hardest thing, and I guess we'll get on to winners in a moment.
This is the winners.
Oh, we're on the winners now.
Yeah, we're on the winners.
Good Lord.
Losers to come. Don't worry.
If we switch tack in a moment and see the other side of the ledger, it'll be interesting. But the reality is that to have a thriving economy with a good sustainable budget surplus, because this one came in with a $9.3 billion surplus. So again, on paper it looks great, it's really, with the level of spending that's been signed up for, that will be reverting back to deficit probably till 2030, I think, looking at the paper I read. We lack a long-term vision for what we're trying to do as a country. There's a long-term lack of vision as far as migration is concerned. There's a lack of vision as far as the housing crisis. Throwing $19 a week is not going to fix it. There's a strategic overhaul that needs to be had that says, listen, we need to build houses, we need to build them in areas we want to attract people to live in, where we can then build business and so on and so forth to have an economy that's thriving, versus is this enough to get us across the line for another 4 years, which I think is really the vision.
Well, I wonder if they've got $9.3 billion in surplus, they could probably spend a bit of that on building some houses. It'd probably fix most of our issues, would it not?
Look, it could be put to good use there. The flip side, of course, that it's also inflationary if you commence public works like that. So it's a really fine balancing act that's involved between committing and achieving your long-term goals versus causing some short-term pain, and perhaps one way of fixing it, if you've got a very clear long-term vision for what you want, and let's say that is in the housing space, where you say we are committed to building 500,000 new dwellings here in Australia. It's going to cost more than everyone thinks it's going to cost. We've covered this previously.
We have, yeah.
And we're expecting to do it in the next 10 years, and it's going to be in the growth corridors that we've elected are areas of the country that need help. How do we fund that? Well, if you can take people that are on the debit side of the ledger that perhaps aren't working because they don't have jobs and get them off the debit side and into the positive side of the ledger where they're contributing members of society, whereby they are employed in this construction boom, or they're going to be having houses and subsequently businesses located in the area they live so they can work, you're really transferring money from a cost to an asset side of the ledger. But it's a political hot potato, that one. Luckily,
Indeed.
we're not in office, we're just in the private sector.
Yeah, got you. Well, hey, let's change gears now, if we can call it that, talk about the losers of the budget. First thing that springs to mind for me is international students. So the government's not provisioning for as many numbers, which means we're going to have less of those, as well as less migrants as well, which unfortunately I think that's been capped at about 185,000 per annum, and they've got to pay an extra $25 on their visa ballot. Thoughts?
So, one of the things that was spoken of a year ago, and again, this comes down to a lack of vision and a destination that you're trying to take something to. And you could argue this is, you have these conversations in your family, this is a family, this is what we stand for, these are our values, or if you're in a business, this is what we stand for, these are our values, this is what we do. And as a nation, they're the sorts of statements that we really need to have. And it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about 1.5 million migrants coming to Australia over the next couple of years, of which half would be students. So what's that, if my maths is correct, 750,000 students, and the revenue line that they then bring into the universities is billions of dollars. It's a great, that was the rhetoric that was spoken of, I'm going to say 6 months ago, probably less than that. And now we've had this total inversion of, actually no, we're going to cut down on the number of students and the total number of migrants to this number instead. What changed in that 4 or 5 month period of time for such a vast change in commitment of this is where we're trying to get to here? Now, I think it's a shame that we don't see more international students come to our country. Our universities on the whole, particularly when you compare them to some of their more colourful US counterparts right now, offer a really good standard of education and real world skills. And you think of some of the different places in Australia where there really are great universities that are world beaters. I've done a number of events, for example, with Bond University, which
Great
has you're an alumni of Bond. So
correct, yeah.
I was at their annual gala ball on Saturday, and just seeing the number of students coming back from overseas, and not Australian students coming in from living overseas, but international students coming back, and hearing some of the success stories of what they've been able to do as a consequence of the great education that they've had is huge. So it is a massive export for Australia, and it's something that we could be and should be very proud of. But at the same time, and there's always an if and an and or an if and a but when it comes to economics, you can't get the rainbow without the storm sometimes. If we have more international students coming in, given most of our universities are located in metropolitan areas, it puts a huge pressure on the housing sector because they are renters, because they're students, they're not buying anywhere. And then you get more and more pressure happening in the rental market, which then displaces people and they can't afford to live there. So it's a really tricky balancing act in that respect as far as students are concerned.
Take that a step further as well. So if we look at the budget in terms of another loser, so universities themselves, now 40% of their revenue by law that's generated from student services and or amenities has to go to student-led organisations. So rather than being able to spend that revenue that they're generating on building student accommodation to get more students in and provide less pressure on the housing market, they're now giving away 40%.
Yeah.
To organisations, that could be the Math Society, the tennis club, whatever it is.
So, I'm going to sound like such a cynic. And
we're prepared.
If I go back to the time when I was at university, all of the student, whether it's the student union, last time I belonged to a union was a student union, the student union, the sports teams, the arts societies, the people that are interested in apiary and beekeeping and all of these different things, they're all self-funded by the students. When you go set up a body and we'll underwrite the cost of doing it, all you're simply doing is getting a group of people together that are used to thriving on a handout. That is not a good way to condition people for the real world outside, unless you're conditioning them for a lifetime of relying on a handout. These are supposed to be the high echelon of society, of thinkers, of entrepreneurs, of drivers of business and politics. Go raise some money for your association yourself and work out how you raise funding, because if you go into business, You're going to have to do that. If you're in life, you're going to have to survive off of the income that you can generate. You can't rely on subsidy. So to me, it's just the dumbest possible conditioning you could possibly introduce, unless you, of course, want an output of slurry that has no ability to think for itself and to be entrepreneurial or be creative and think, how can we fix the fact that we need more money? I know we'll do a fundraiser. Let's do that, or let's do this, or let's add some value by doing some services here. That's what a future society is built on if you want a robust society, not one that relies on sucking on the bottle for help. So I agree with you. It's a terrible, terrible piece of legislation. And what's more, the long-term costs, all these things are great in the short term. Oh, great, we've got all these facilities for our union or our association. But the long-term cost down the line, as you rightly identify, is less money to go into things like student accommodation or student amenities to create better quality graduates that have got the ability to contribute more to society, the economy, to take that knowledge base back to their home country and expand it and create good changes there too. And instead, we'll just give them a nice warm bottle of milk to suck on without having to do anything for it. Terrible.
It's funny you say that, because there was a student-led organisation at my uni, and it was called BASIC. It was the Beer Appreciation and Social Intercourse Club, which I
Founding
thought,
member or?
Yeah, no, I'm just a willing participant, I will admit. But you think of that's a student-led organisation where 40% of the funding is going to amongst other groups. It's not it.
Look, it's the wrong message, and that's not a hard, fast capitalist set of lenses to look for. It's how life works in the current society. Maybe we're going to be in a very different looking society. I suppose the challenge there is particularly given some of the political tensions that we're seeing on campus at the moment, and I mean the obvious one of that is some of the anti-Semitic behaviour that we're seeing around. If you create a society that's about campus protest, does that get funded by the university? And if it does, well, and you're supporting a terrorist organisation, for example, isn't the university sponsoring terrorism? In which case it's, anyway, conversation for a sidebar, maybe a beer at your association at Bond there. But,
Ex-association.
the reality is it's a very poorly thought out piece of legislation.
Indeed. Now, last but not least, on the losers ledger, AB, how could we forget the NDIS? So previously, at the NDIS, you're allocated an amount of funding, and if you exhaust that, you can then ask for a top-up. More often than not, people were getting top-ups. That is no longer the case. So if you're in the NDIS, it's probably not great.
Look, that is true, and there are always winners and losers in any kind of budget and any kind of trade-off. The NDIS, as it stands, I think is probably the single pillar of socialist policy that we have in our country that's got the potential to really bankrupt our country, because up until now it's been this spiralling pit of costs with no real end in sight. And to be very, very clear on this, there are people that need the support that's provided by it. And then there are people that choose, in spite of the fact that they qualify, to go, no, I'm going to be a contributing member of society. And there are millions of people that are like that, and hats off to those people that are entitled to help, but their pride or their drive or their desire to want to contribute to society and have a more positive identity of not being a victim or someone that's supported to be a supporter is huge. I'll give you two personal examples of that. One is my sister-in-law, who had a cancerous brain tumour, who worked as an oncology nurse and is a nurse to this day, contributing to society. She could very, very easily qualify for it, and it was not even a discussion point in our family. And just to reassure belief in humanity, just the other day, I was in a regional area. I was in Lismore, as a matter of fact, and which is in northern New South Wales, trying to bounce back from the terrible floods of a number of years ago now, 3 years ago. And there was a girl working in the cafe with some very obvious mental and physical impairments, who was just doing an outstanding job of working in the cafe. And I was actually there with my father-in-law, and it prompted a really interesting conversation about the whole NDIS system, that there's someone, again, if they chose to, could put their hand up and say, I'd like that and deserve it and need it. But no, instead, place more value on being a contributing member of society. And I think people's human needs, sure, we need money to help us live, and there are many, many ways we can help people do that. at the same time, I think there's also a need to feel like you belong to something that's positive, to give you that optimism for life. And there's nothing worse than having a negative outlook on your future. If you've got a positive outlook on your future, life is much easier to get up every day and do stuff. And if you rely on a government subsidy for your income, that can be quite soul-destroying in taking everything away. Now, there'll be people listening to this going, I deserve, we're not saying whether or not you're a deserving recipient of that. That's the last thing we'd entertain in this particular discussion. That said, from the other side of the ledger, given the fact that we are talking about a budget, is that maybe there are areas of the NDIS that should be further tightened up so it doesn't become this albatross around the neck of the Australian economy where there are less loopholes to be exploited, which most certainly are happening. I was speaking with a family law specialist just a couple of weeks ago who's working with a family where there are 5 children, each of which is qualifying for, it's about $400,000 household income that they're now pulling from NDIS. And without being too cynical, probably at least 2, if not 3 of the kids under more objective lenses probably wouldn't qualify for what they're getting. However, it's been railroaded through, and there's $400,000 a year for the taxpayer to be contributing to an area where maybe it's not as much as that, or maybe not even at all under more objective lenses. And we've got to be very careful that we don't build a social security system that crushes our economy. And the UK is going through this right now with the National Health Service, which, when it came into effect, I think it was 1947, before I was born, before you start that, right, way before I was born.
You knew my tricks by now, don't you?
Yeah, I do. That was the Lord Beveridge was the person that introduced that, and it's one of the most marvellous legacies I think of a politician could create is a health system that's there as a safety net to help people, and it's free. These days, of course, the UK, like so many countries around the world, is being crushed by immigration, a lot of illegal immigration, and a vast explosion in its population beyond what it's capable of supporting there. And you've got a social security system now that's costing beyond what it can afford to support. The stakeholders are being let down, the patients are being let down, and maybe if some more prudent footwork was undertaken 10 or 15 years ago, it would still be able to provide what it was designed to, which is genuine support and care for people that truly need it. And I hope I'm wrong on this. I really wouldn't want to see our NDIS system go down that pathway. If it's managed in the right way, it's something that could be very sustainable and help people that truly need it. So good to see some no top-up measures put in there. I guess as a taxpayer, as a taxpayer, we haven't talked about some of the losers, which of course are higher income groups where their tax cuts haven't flown through. And you could argue, poor me, I didn't get all the tax cut I'm deserving, but nobody minds paying tax when they see the money being put to good use.
That's right, indeed. I think that's a pretty good summary, AB. That's not just winners and losers of the budget. We've actually talked about what it means down the line, which I think is most important.
It's crucial. And again, some people listening to this might feel that maybe it's a little right wing in terms of the lens that we're looking through. And I desperately try, where possible, there's the asterisk, to try and be objective when I look at things, to say, okay, short, medium, long term, is this a good thing for our economy? And it's very, very hard to make that call when our leadership has no vision for what we need to be in the next, not 4 years, but 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, when my 5 children are older and living in this. So it does make it quite hard. And overall, on some level, you think, oh, gee, that's not a bad budget. There's some benefits here, and that's good. And, it's helping certain groups. But when you look at where it's going to lead us to long term, which without question is stickier and higher levels of inflation, without question leaves our housing crisis totally unfixed. And without question is not going to result in lower energy bills. It's just a short-term bump, and bills aren't going to get cheaper on the back of it. Next year there'll be more because there's more money flowing in the economy. You go, well, where's the long-term fix for this? All you've done is moved around the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. Looks pretty cool for a few minutes. Oh, that's not a bad effort. Well done, doctor. You did a good job. When in reality, the longer-term problem is a far worse situation than we're in currently. And that's poor leadership, because a responsibility of a leader is really to create a more opportunistic, a happier, and I guess a more fulfilling society for our people. And there's not a lot that I see in that budget that's going to deliver that, and that's the real tragedy.
You heard it here first. AB, thanks very much for your insights today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, anytime, Mitch. There you have it, guys. Make sure you give us a review and a rating. Helps more people get the show, and we'll look forward to hosting you next week.